Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
State Representative Gordon Hintz of Oshkosh is the Assembly Democratic leader seeking re-election in the 54th Assembly District. Gordon, welcome back to WisconsinEye.
Hey, always good to be here, Steve.
Gordon, give me a sense of how much the pandemic is shaping the November 3 elections, even for the Assembly. Just give me the overview, please.
Well, it's changed everything. Obviously, it's changed campaigning, but I think for the public, focus that would have normally been on, education, jobs, the economy, the problems of the day, all of those probably still exist, but they're all COVID related. Parents that have their schools closing or doing virtual education, they want to know that there are going to be resources to fund safety, technology, flexibility, and try to maintain some semblance of normalcy. And the impact on the economy has been uneven, but obviously there's a lot of questions about the future. There's a lot of anxiety that's out there, and clearly on healthcare, people that are worried about being sick, worried about getting coverage, all of the flaws of the United States healthcare system are sort of being exposed by the pandemic, and are raising questions about what state and federal government should do in all of these areas. So it is the lens, and obviously it's a real debate given the divide between President Trump and sort of his position, and really the Republicans in Wisconsin matching him on saying, well, this isn't that big a deal, or we got to move on, or survival of the fittest, or it's a hoax. And that's very different, obviously, from Joe Biden, Tony Evers, and quite frankly, Assembly Democrats.
Well, given your experience on finance, I'm going to make up a number. If we're $1 billion short in general fund tax collections because of the pandemic, and I make up the number, how do you think? How would you and your caucus want to fill that gap?
Well, obviously, there's going to be a lot of speculation at what the makeup of the legislature is going to be, and of course, the big question is probably what role is the federal government going to play, given that every state is looking at some negative impacts on revenues due to the pandemic, and having a lot of the same challenges about how they fund schools, universities. I mean, we're in that perfect storm where there's less revenue, but there's actually more demand for state and government services. And so it's kind of a perfect storm. So the questions will be, what federal funding might be available. That played a big part in our ability to really get out of the recession in Wisconsin in 2009, but we still had tough choices to make in the budget. Really, there will be cuts regardless if we don't have that same kind of support. But the good news right now is the latest revenue options that we've seen is in Wisconsin's economy has come back faster. More people have been reemployed than I think we're in the top 15 in terms of recovery. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have people that have been displaced, devastated, and probably a lot of uncertainty in terms of their employment future in that field. But from a revenue standpoint, we're actually closer to the budget that was passed. We just don't have that surplus that we have forecasted. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. But those budget decisions are ultimately about trade-offs on, cutting and the trade-offs between cutting spending and looking at new revenue, given that there are certain demands on government that need to be funded. I mean, quite frankly, it'll make more sense than ever to expand Medicaid, if not just for the $300 million of taxpayer money that can be saved. I mean, that has to be an option if we're looking at a shortfall.
On September 28th, the governor has a decision. Should he extend the statewide mask edict, or should he let it lapse and die? What do you think?
I'm hopeful and think the governor will do the right thing to expand the mandate. I think the numbers that we're seeing, some of them tied to the return to college from a lot of students in the younger demographic, demonstrates that we clearly need this. There's so much we don't know about the coronavirus, but what we do know is the countries and the states and the municipalities that have been most successful at curbing the transmission of the virus have followed best practices and made it the thing to do, including mask wearing. And that's what we need to do. I mean, your decision impacts other people. And I think we really need to continue to do this until we find, a vaccine, treatments. I mean, we're learning more, we're getting better, but the numbers in Wisconsin suggest that we have a ways to go. If we want to restore the economy, if we want to normalize education, if we want to minimize the risk of transmission, it's the right thing to do. And I think communities around the state support that.
The frontline role of hospitals, both nationally and in Wisconsin, that we've seen, does this mean in the next budget, hospitals should get an even bigger priority than they may have in the current budget?
Well, look, clearly Wisconsin hospitals have a tremendous role, and I think their capacity and their management of the COVID crisis has been one of our successes. If you remember at the early point of wondering if we were going to see, Italian style overwhelming of our system, even though we had a surge in cases, our capacity has always been, able to manage it. And that's really a testament to the hospitals and that we have in the state and their commitment to preparing and making it work. But we know that there has been lost revenue. We do know there are increased costs really to all businesses that are taking precautionary measures and that are doing things to hopefully protect frontline employees to exposure. I think 40 million of the CARES Act money went to hospitals. I think it probably will be part of the discussion, although given that every state is impacted and we're looking at flat or declining revenue, this would be an area that I think the federal government would be better suited to direct funding to. And again, there's a pot of money I know about with more than $300 million that we could use that for keeping the money in healthcare. I think Medicaid expansion would be another avenue for the state to consider if we did need to put more money in.
The bill by Senator Capping, Representative Bourne, says organizations, businesses, even nonprofits who follow COVID-19 protocols could not be sued over COVID-19 lawsuit. Could you support that bill?
No, at least right now. I mean, quite frankly, this seems to be an attempt to rush businesses back to opening before perhaps they're ready to. I mean, we haven't seen a rush of litigation in this area. We have seen workplaces, especially meatpacking and some other places around the country, where they not only won't allow masks, but they require people to work side by side. And we've seen disproportionate transmission of the virus at the workplace among minority populations, lower income populations. And again, putting this broad protection, which is something that has always probably been pursued by conservatives on tort reform, is sort of trying to be opportunistic and would make it more likely that a lot of businesses would open and not put the measures in place, given some of the standards that I've seen put into both at least the federal legislation and I'm assuming this boilerplate bill by Senator Capping. So, again, I just think on a lot of fronts, this is contrary to ultimately what we want to see. If businesses are doing the right thing, meeting the safety guidelines and protecting their workforce, they shouldn't have anything to worry about.
The debate over policing reform that we've seen nationally and even at our front door in Kenosha over the last 3 to 4 months. Now, the governor has 9 bills, Senator Weingart 7 or 8. Speaker's going to form a task force. What specific policing reforms do you think must be enacted?
Well, I mean, something like banning chokeholds. I think even the Professional Police Association has, come out and saying, that's something that, again, hopefully would have a positive impact in terms of the application, but symbolically would demonstrate that we're going to reconsider some of the tactics that have been used in disproportionately against people of color, specifically Black males around the country. Some of the push by Governor Evers was to both address, tactics and use of force, but a lot of it was also to address racial disparities and to demonstrate to the public that this was a priority, and to demonstrate specifically to Black people There's a reason why the Milwaukee Bucks and a lot of, celebrities and others were saying it's time to act. It's time to demonstrate that we do care, that Black lives do matter, and it should matter to all of us. So I think there are some things that we would be ready to pass that would start moving the needle, but would also demonstrate to a public who's probably cynical that government will ever act, that we're willing to. And then there should be longer term discussions and more deliberation about criminal justice reform, about infant mortality, about the impact of segregation on minority populations in terms of school funding, water quality, lead pipes, just things that are built into our government, our practices that reinforce systemic racism. The conversation's not new, but certainly the urgency really is. And I think we're having a moment, and our job in state government is to address, the big issues of the day. And this one's not going away.
The dynamics of medical and recreational marijuana have changed as states around Wisconsin legalized them. What's your position now?
I support certainly full medicinal legalization. And I think Governor Evers kind of laid out a framework to move towards recreational if it's the right thing to do. I think we need to have a deliberative discussion on this, but Wisconsin is out of line with both the rest of the country, but also with its population. We've seen the polls, at 80% in support of medicinal. We've got a number of states that we can look at what their experience has been. I don't think it means we're sending a signal that we want everybody smoking dope, but this is one where people under 30 have really changed the conversation, and where public opinion really is changing. And again, the more states that have the experience, the more people understand that the benefits outweigh the costs. I think we need to have a more serious conversation on it. It should be deliberative. We should take the input of health experts and others. We should look at the experiences of other states. But this shouldn't be one where some curmudgeons in the state Senate or state assembly are able to just say bah humbug because of some 1970s mentality.
On property taxes, the limits, the caps that local governments have been living with to control property taxes for more than 20 years. Should those limits be continued to hold down property taxes on homes?
Well, one of the frustrating things as a homeowner in Wisconsin and as someone that's been, in government has been our over-reliance on the property taxes and getting that bill every December. Obviously, there are trade-offs. Some folks like the deduction and understand it and perhaps pay in installments, but, we don't give local governments many options. And we've cut money over the years and we've squeezed them. When you look at the fact that Kenosha, for a city of its size, didn't have body cameras for law enforcement, it was largely a fiscal decision. Other communities have. So, I brought up the first point to suggest that I'm always open to wholesale revenue reform that looks at taking things off the property taxes if we can come up with a dedicated source of revenue that is more progressive or that reduces property taxes. But that's a bigger discussion. That's been harder to move. You've got winners and losers and pros and cons. But if we're going to keep levy limits in place, which I think the public supports and we largely support in terms of keeping property taxes down, we either have to provide an increase in direct funding, a reduction in some mandates, or giving more local options, and that could be local option revenue. Perhaps passed by referendum or just by the council, but also perhaps flexibility. And because a lot of communities like Oshkosh have already purchased body cameras, have had them in place for a while, maybe we allowed an exemption on levy limits for things like the purchase of body cameras so that the other municipalities in the state can catch up. Because if the state were to provide direct funding for for instance, the communities that have already made that a priority and investments, wouldn't be eligible for it. So we've done that for energy efficiency and for other things for school districts. And I guess, if we're going to keep the levy limits on and funding is going to be kind of flat, maybe look at some exemptions for needs and priorities that the states want to see municipalities do and give them the flexibility.
A year and a half ago, the governor recommended raising the gas tax. It's now 30.9 cents. Hasn't been raised in more than 10 years to stabilize how we pay for highways and bridges. What's your position on raising the gas tax now?
My position is we certainly need more revenue. The costs of inaction have led to, increased borrowing and declining infrastructure and delayed and deferred maintenance, which only costs more going forward. No one likes, the Republicans increased fees. This was the first budget that we ended up getting new money, but it was more of a one-time solution than a multi-year solution, which is really what we need. In many ways, the gas tax makes the most sense. Restoring indexing, I think, should be a no-brainer to cover some inflation. But I'm open to other things. I don't like some of the revenue options. I think tolls are inefficient and regressive. I don't think that anybody's actually serious. That sort of gets thrown out there. But I'm open to other discussions. We, had Republican support for weight-based measures and other things. But the gas tax in many ways makes the most sense. But, this is going to take enough people coming together to decide that it's more financially responsible to actually pay for the things you need instead of borrowing and kicking things down the road. So I know transportation revenue is down. So this is another budget discussion that we'll need to have, that we're seeing revenue down at a time when we still have some needs to be met. So I think, the governor started the conversation last time by saying, infrastructure is a priority, paying for it's a priority, here's my plan. And we ended up with something that was better than nothing, but was really just kick the can again down the road for 2 years.
Why is the governor's proposal for a People's Maps Commission to draw the next congressional and legislative district lines such a priority with the governor and your caucus?
Well, because everything that people hate about politics, all the dysfunction that exists, the difference between what's a priority for 70, 80% of the state of Wisconsin and what actually happens is a direct result of the gerrymandering that we've seen in the state, which again, a federal court ruled was unconstitutional, before the Supreme Court ultimately punted on it. The reality is, when you make districts and you insulate members from having to be accountable to the voters, you don't get those priorities passed. For instance, when Republicans met to take away Governor Evers' powers and Attorney General Call's powers before they were sworn in, you had members on their side saying, well, I don't support this, but I'll lose my seat if I vote against it, or I'll be punished by leadership. And so the accountability that's there isn't with the voters in general. It is with, primary voters or the most extreme voters. And quite frankly, it's on the right and the left. By drawing districts the way they do, you create a higher number of districts that are 80% partisan one way or another. And what happens is you tend to get more extreme members, further away. So there's fewer people in the middle that might be more likely to find a third way or to compromise. And, it makes competitive elections, difficult. And so we don't have a real discussion. And I think people get frustrated with the fact that why are the decisions made by lawmakers so out of line with what our priorities are? So I think the public's getting it. When we first discussed redistricting in 2012, 2013, sort of as an issue, it was, this is inside baseball. People won't understand this. But the number of people that have brought it up, the number of county resolutions that have been out there, Governor Evers and others sort of highlighting, like, why wouldn't we take Medicaid expansion when I think close to 40 states, when all of our neighboring states, when Republican states have taken it, even just for the money, or even, is largely an ideological response because they don't have to, and there's not accountability. So any voter out there who wants their government to be responsive, that wants to have decision-making made in the best interest of the people, should get behind this. And, I'm hopeful that we'll have a good faith process and a recognition of that, and at worst end up with neutral court-drawn maps that will allow Wisconsin to be more reflective of the people of the state.
The proposal that says if a school district or a local government plans a major public works project, they should give a preference to Wisconsin businesses. What's your position on that?
I think it's a good idea. I also think that, quality is something that gets sacrificed when you just allow it to be a race to the bottom, and we drain resources and ask them to get two guys in a truck to do a project. things like prevailing wage have been both good for the economy and good for the quality and good for the taxpayers, in terms of these things. And so it's taxpayer dollars to the extent that we can spend those in the community with competitive, bids and projects by, local contractors. I think that is a win-win, and I think also ensures quality.
Last question, differences between you and your opponent on November 3?
Well, I live in the district. My opponent does not live in the district currently, so that's one. But obviously on COVID, he sort of follows the president's line that it's a hoax, that we shouldn't have to wear masks, these violate their rights. And, quite frankly, that is crushing businesses, that is, hurting schools. And that's a real contrast with what we need to do to be able, the economy is not going to be fixed. Schools aren't going to be normalized until we can contain the virus. And so the last thing we need in Madison is more people putting a narrative out there that's anti-science, that's anti-public health, and anti-business.
Thank you. State Representative Gordon Hintz of Oshkosh is the Assembly Democratic leader seeking re-election in the 54th Assembly District. Gordon, thank you for talking to WisconsinEye.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.